All right, this is going to be a very fast episode. I mentioned this in the other day's video, but I went through a bunch more of Kropotkin's The Conquest of Bread, and chapters 5 through 9 don't offer that much, except for like the same error, the same fallacy over and over again, a bunch of really weird utopian kind of, gosh, I think it's going to happen like this once everybody realizes that they're free of wage labor, and then a bunch of really like economics so bad that it's like anti-economics. So for chapters 5 through 9, and it seems like man, we're going through a lot in one little session, but like we're going to go through like a worst of format for these 5 chapters because they're basically a repetition over and over again of the same mistakes, only applied to food, dwellings, clothing. Chapter 8 is called Ways and Means, which basically means capital goods, and then luxuries is chapter 9. So, bear with me here. Step 1 of a Kropotkin revolution. Bread for all. The people take possession of all food and keep strict account of it, ensuring none might be wasted. Those are quotes from the book. All food is to be rationed. Quote, bands of volunteers, end quote, take inventory of food and publish those inventories. Same is true of dwellings and clothing. This is pure utopian gibberish, especially gibberish in the case of highly perishable goods like foods. Such inventories would usually be useless by the time they were written, let alone published and distributed. Therefore, this process is innately destructive to perishable goods, of which food is the most dangerous example. This assumes no self-serving activity by inventory takers. It assumes that even if you had an inventory, you would know what to do with it, where to send things. You know, that's something that Mises and Hayek have broken down and shown is just simply not possible, that you need a price structure and, exchange in order to understand where things are needed. So basically, Kropotkin's like central planning, but not central planning, and volunteer, but, the volunteers will be angels dancing on the head of a pin. It's nonsensical. And then he applies it to food first. And so it's great to see that the first thing we get out of this is starvation. Then he does it with dwellings, clothing, capital goods, and luxuries. So first we starve, then we're homeless, then we're naked, then we can't produce anything, and finally we don't have any luxuries. Good to know. So there's a funny point in chapter 5, I believe, where Kropotkin admits to being utopian. He says, quote, it is not people's way to clamor for the moon in one of the later, in the dwellings chapter. He says that the masses will never demand the impossible. People will naturally, quote, shake down amicably, end quote, to what's available, quote, with the least possible friction and disturbance, end quote. Equality will spread outward gradually. Yeah, in a pig's eye, right? This is not, first off, admitting that you're a utopian is not a great perspective for an attempt at developing a revolutionary system for organizing society. It means, if you're a utopian, it means that you're not just an idealist, but blinded by your ideals, and that can be a problem. Hell, I have a hard enough time squeezing utopian strains out of libertarianism as I try to explain things. Imagine trying to do that with friggin' communism, and even worse, anarcho-communism, which, as we're seeing, is an incredibly self-contradictory and nonsensical doctrine. One thing that Kropotkin does at one point is he examines Marx's distinction between simple and unskilled labor versus complex or skilled labor. He says that capitalists, quote, live without working. He talks about the production of, quote, useful commodities, and, quote, instead of, quote, useless middlemen, unquote. Marx's distinction between skilled and unskilled labor, or simple and complex labor, was an attempt to paper over the falsity of the labor theory of value. You see, the thing about the labor theory of value is that it doesn't hurt that much if you're not trying to centrally plan things. If you're letting things go by the invisible hand, if there's no person who says, the value of this is this, and therefore you must sell it for this, if there's no one doing that, the fantasy of a labor theory of value doesn't do that much damage. There's going to be a few intellectuals in ivory towers who claim that, this guy is selling these diamonds for the wrong price, or this guy's selling this bread for the wrong price, whatever. But, since they have no actual power over the economy, since, since the prevailing ideal in Adam Smith's time was tempered but fairly laissez-faire, having an incorrect theory of value didn't make much difference. If you start trying to centrally plan things, if you start trying to centrally plan production, distribution, etc., then you actually need to have a good understanding of how value works. Now, Marx has a bit of an excuse because he died, far too late for Marx to have died. Like, he should have died much, much earlier. But he did die around the time of the subjective marginal revolution. And so we can kind of forgive him for not having a good understanding of, nascent value theory. Kropotkin does not have that excuse. This book was written in the 1890s, which was at least 20 years after Menger, Walras, and the other guy, whose name I frequently forget, came up with the subjective value revolution and finally put the last nails in the coffin of the labor theory of value. Fair enough. For Marx to not know about these things, fair enough. For Kropotkin to not know about it strikes me kind of like an ostrich with his head in the sand. It's worth noting also that if you have the wrong framework and something at the bottom of the framework goes away, it doesn't automatically make people realize that the rest of the framework is invalid. The collapse of the labor theory of value should have killed off Marx's exploitation theory, but it didn't, because the people who were promoting that kind of nonsense were so far up their own you-know-whats that the disproving of the labor theory of value was something that they completely missed. So, proper subjective value theory understands that some kinds of labor get higher remuneration because of the value that consumers place on that labor or its output. Further, basic entrepreneurial theory shows us that sometimes the guy who's really good at making watches isn't the best at selling them, or shows us that there's value in having watches that might be produced by multitudes of craftsmen collected in a central point for retail sale. Middlemen have their uses, in short. And I think I mentioned Walter Block's defense of the middleman in Defending the Undefendable in an earlier episode. Feel free to check that out if you feel like it. The next fun thing that Kropotkin talks about is that how there are certain areas where wood and pasture lands are available in such large quantities that they're operated communally. And he says, well, in our commune, once we establish it, there will be communal wood and pasture, quote, so long as there is plenty. He then talks about how, if anything becomes scarce, well, we'll have to ration that, obviously. But instead of rationing it to the people who want it most, we'll ration it to the ones who somebody decides needs it most. Which has some sense of value to it, like giving good food to sick people, but only on the surface, right? Because he's talking about giving like really rich foods to sick people, whereas if you're really sick, sometimes you can't digest the really rich foods. You need porridge and not, roasted pheasant. So the problem, of course, with this is that it's basically the tragedy of the commons writ large. And then as soon as the commons start to become scarce, as soon as they start to get used up, you get rationing of the rapidly falling scarce reserves. These societies that have unlimited wood and pasture land have very strong social, generally speaking, have very strong social forces that encourage people to not take too much. That is to say, they live in very small villages or very small towns, and so if someone is actually taking a lot, he'll get shunned by his neighbors. Of course, in the commune, where everyone is the same, that's much less likely to happen, because anybody who is doing this can simply go hide somewhere else in town, claiming that he's going to join a different part of the commune. The other thing worth noting is that someone is going to have to arrogate to himself the right to decide rations, and then, well, we're not in anarcho-communism anymore, are we? Kropotkin goes off on the idea of communal kitchens, and he says, well, what they'll do is they'll cook the food most of the way, and then the last touches, quote, last touches, end quote, will be chosen by the consumer. And that in the communist communal kitchens, there will be no risk of poison or cheating in communal kitchens, which is false. Right? People have, accidentally, Even people in good faith have accidentally food poisoned people, in situations of like public charity. It's happened. It's not like Kropotkin's communist revolution is going to make it so that doesn't happen. But it's also worth noting that Kropotkin says that this won't be a permanent fixture. Fair enough. But if he understands how cooking works as little as he understands how civilization works, we're probably going to be in a bad place. Next up. This is a really common fallacy. He says that, at some point, provisions may run short, but provisions running short is merely proof that the people are finally well fed. Bernie Sanders made the same stupid mistake. He's like, bread lines mean that people are finally getting the food that they deserve. And it's like, no, they're wasting their time standing in lines for food because it's so scarce, and because the method of distribution is based not on delivery, but on standing in the line, right? If everybody was getting the amount of food that they needed delivered to them every day at their doorstep, right, by magic angels or whatever, then they wouldn't need to stand in the line unless they needed extra food. These people are standing in line because, number one, if they don't get the food, they'll starve, and number two, they're hungry already, so they can't work that well after all. In economic terms, though, let's break this into economic terms. Demand for food is not elastic according to supply. Demand for food becomes elastic towards supply when starvation begins to occur and kills off excess demand. But that's the thing that we can't turn back the clock on. If it so happens that 50% of the people starve, yes, the demand for food went down, and maybe these rations can be spread out so that people don't starve anymore, but you can't reverse that transmission and fix the problem later. Those 50% of people that died, they're gone. They're not coming back. So, Kropotkin has this really dumb, like pie-in-the-sky view of how goods are, how what is produced is decided and how goods should be distributed. He basically says, all right, here's what happens. The farmers keep working, they get all their food, they bring it to the city, and the city people keep working. They keep making, farming implements. And the farmers come to the city, they drop off their food, and they pick up whatever implements they need from the city. And it's like, so quote, farmers, quote, take from our stores and shops all the manufactured articles you please. He's addressing them. Farmers, you take from our stores. So anyway, so the idea is that the farmer will take what he needs because he's convinced he's no longer being exploited. This is a central planning fallacy. This is broken down by Mises. This is broken down by Hayek. This is broken down easily. In addition to the fact that there's nothing there's nothing to ensure, that's the word, that the correct capital goods are produced that the farmers need in the right quantities. There's nothing to encourage innovation. It encourages people in the city to produce the wrong distribution of capital goods. It encourages the people on the farms to produce the wrong distribution of food items. The farmers can't own the capital goods with any security anyway, which will lead to a glut of consumption, as either farmers take what they think they might need, or, and here's the part, what they think they might need plus what they think roving bands of communist busybodies will take from them. It basically leads to a glut of consumption in both places, right? The farmers will eat more of their own food, and they'll consume more capital goods. And the people in the city will consume more food, and they'll produce the wrong capital goods, and everything will get all messed up. Then, as a counter to arguments against anarcho-communism, Kropotkin says, well, you know what? People need to start making the stuff that they need for themselves more. We'll have additional optional, people will work for 5 days doing necessary work. No, sorry, not 5 days. 5 hours per day making necessary goods. And then any additional work that they'll do will be for their own luxury goods, for the provision of luxury goods, or for the establishment of their own hobbies or whatever. He talks about the establishment of these voluntary societies for writers, musicians, scientists, etc., where the labor is split equally among members. This is so economically backward that it's hard to even believe, because the division of labor is one of the most fundamental economic principles for increasing productivity, specialization. The fact that Kropotkin ignores it shows he's ignorant of basic economics, but, who's surprised by that? Ignoring and subverting the division of labor will decrease productivity on average, not increase it, as Kropotkin presumes. It will result in much larger capital consumption as more people will need to consume capital goods during training, right? If the writer is also learning to cast and typeset his own works, then he's going to waste a lot of whatever, usually lead or pewter, to make those typefaces as he learns, as opposed to, one guy doing the writing who's good at the writing and one guy doing the typefacing who's good at typefacing. Instead, you'll have, and on a higher scale, it gets even crazier, right? Because if you have 50 writers and 50 typefacers, that's pretty darn efficient. But if you have 100 guys who are both trying to learn to write and to typeface, not only do you get a bunch of wasted materials in the training of the 100 typefacers, you also get a lot of crappy writing from the writers who ought to be typefacers. I mean, it's funny because Kropotkin was like a Russian prince or something, right? And it's like, have you never broken a plate or like burned like some food into like a gross crust on the bottom of a pot or a pan? Have you ever cooked a bad meal? Learning to do things correctly involves additional waste. And so spreading training for every single possible skill to every single possible person, at least compared to the alternative, where their specialization is going to waste a lot more materials. It's pretty bad. Next up, productivity of labor will increase because the people no longer feel as if they're exploited. Kropotkin makes an appeal to the use of machinery for increasing productivity, but this is, again, a mistake. The abolition of private ownership will strongly discourage innovation. It will strongly discourage the production of new or untested capital goods, or capital goods in different proportions, right? There might be a farmer who discovers that, that he was working with like one plow and one ox and one sickle or two sickles for a given season. That if he uses 2 oxen, 2 plows, and 1 sickle, he somehow manages to increase his productivity. I don't know. I haven't really thought through the example, but you can see that changing those. That if everybody in the city is just making things in the same proportions that they used to, well, maybe that'll work for now. But if someone decides, hey, if I change my proportion of capital goods for production and get better results, that'd be great. I should do that because I'll be more productive by doing so. But unfortunately, by doing this, he throws the entire economy into out of whack because there's no way for him to inform the city people that, hey, we need things in these different proportions now. I guess roving gangs of volunteers with lists will figure it out. It's not too smart. In a communal system, the invention of new machines will happen less often, not more often, as opposed to one of private ownership and homesteading. If you can, come up with a new item and trade secret it, then that is going to be encouraging to you actually doing that more often, as opposed to you come up with a new thing and someone immediately swipes it from you and you don't gain anything from it. Then here's the real kicker. Kropotkin's like, well, what we'll do in Paris is we'll take all the parks and we'll turn them into farmland. First off, this is in the food section where Kropotkin's like, well, to make sure that everybody's not hungry, we'll take the parks that are currently, lorded over by the nobility and we'll turn them into farmland. The funny thing about this is that it conflicts with Kropotkin's own argument in the luxury section, where he's like, well, everybody will just, do their hobby things based on, the availability. We'll just produce luxuries en masse. And, because, different people like different things, it'll all work out. So like the parks are a luxury good. They're a place for a person to sit and contemplate nature in the city, in the middle of the city. He's going to destroy all of these luxury items in order to hope to stave off starvation for a couple extra days in Paris. It's It's worth noting that he ignores his later argument here in order to show how Paris isn't going to starve. It's also worth noting that the conversion of parks to arable farmland is labor, capital, and time intensive. We see other things like how Kropotkin equates inequalities with injustices. If inequality is equal to injustice, then there can be no reward for excess production. Therefore, there will be no excess production. Or, I mean, there might be a little bit, but human charity is not an infinite resource. What's going to end up having to happen is, violent coercion of saying, oh yeah, you have to make sure you work this particular amount of time, and then we also have to have supervisors to make sure that people are doing productive work for those 5 hours. Because remember, if there's no person supervising, then you might do 5 hours making a really nice looking mud pie, but no one wants that. A laissez-faire economy with private property fixes that problem. Communalism does not. Kropotkin goes on about how the great evil of capitalism lies not in surplus value existing, but in the possibility of surplus value existing. That is to say, the private holding of capital goods. If everything to be used, but this is just like rhetoric. Everything that is to be used is owned, whether there's a deed to it or not, whether Kropotkin likes it or not. The use is the ownership. If there's no possibility for titles or things like that. The person who eats the apple owns the apple. And if any other person can stop him from eating that apple, then, what's going to happen is that everybody's going to starve. This principle that the possibility of surplus value existing, despite the fact that the death of the labor theory of value means that there is no surplus value problem, this principle makes it so that any productive people will basically be expropriated not just of their extra production, but of the capital goods that enable them to produce. A really good shoemaker will have his tools stolen so that people who don't know how to make shoes will learn how to make shoes. We're almost done. Kropotkin says, hey, let's make sure that we produce, quote, the greatest amount of goods with, quote, least possible waste. And it's like, well, that would be money prices, voluntary trade, private ownership, homesteading, and self-ownership. Not this communist gobbledygook. So the next thing he talks about is how the projection... He does a bunch of number nonsense. And he fails to understand that capital structures are responsible for these numbers looking as they are. And breaking down the capital structure will make those numbers not the same. But anyway, he says something along these lines. The projection of productivity levels by labor hours is required. 5 hours per day at necessary work for men from the ages of roughly 20 to 50. Women spend their time educating children over the same time span. Masons and carpenters will alter existing housing to equalize dwellings with a few hours per day of labor. But the problem is that with no methods for determining what is to be produced, productivity will fall in practical terms rather than grow. There will be dozens of large, unusable nails produced before anybody figures out that they can't be used. There will be a gradual decay of craftsmanship in all goods. Low-skilled people will be doing a larger chunk of the production, and their produce will be mixed in with the produce of the unskilled craftsmen. There will be constant redistribution by gangs of inventory-taking busybodies and people who waste goods. Finally, and this is the last point we're going to talk about for these 5 chapters. Kropotkin has this weird idea that personal preference will deal with the scarcity problem of luxury goods. He's like, well, not everybody wants a telescope. Some people want microscopes. And so if we just make a bunch of telescopes and microscopes, it'll basically hash itself out. No, it's more likely that rationing will be the solution to this problem. There's no reason to expect the preferences for certain luxury goods to be evenly distributed among the population, and even less reason, or maybe about the same amount of reason, to assume that the creators of the luxury goods will produce the same distribution as is wanted. Prices and voluntary exchange and private ownership solve these problems. Central planning literally cannot. So, that is our examination of the Conquest of Bread chapters 5 through 9. Food, dwellings, clothing, capital goods, luxuries. It is an exceedingly nonsensical examination of how the economy works. It is an appeal to central planning without saying the word central planning. It is psychotically utopian, and it is likely to result in, starvation, privation, and the end of civilization. But with that said, I did find that there was at least some more interesting-ish stuff that should be addressed in chapters 10 and up. So we're going to start there next week, and we're going to take a look at those, or at least one of those or something. One of those or something like that. And we're going to keep going until we finish this book out, because I think I've already shown that there's not much good in these ideas, and that they're likely to result in things that Kropotkin believes they won't. But I still think there's some value in breaking down what's actually said in this book, as opposed to simply dismissing it. Maybe I'm wrong. I don't know. We'll see. In any case, I will get this up, and hopefully some people will enjoy it. As always, thanks for watching. Thanks for listening. If you have any thoughts on Kropotkin, feel free to leave a comment. If you like the channel and you like what I'm doing, you know what to do. And I will say thank you for your time, and I will see you soon with some other video that I'm preparing. Anyway, Conquest of Bread, chapters 5 through 9. Not very smart. See you later.